Welcome back to Tariq Amba podcast and videocast. I am your host, Solomon Kabriye. We are back after a hiatus, but have returned to continue to present Ethiopian history to all our fans, and will resume where we left off at the end of the reign of the medieval emperor Dawit I. Please subscribe, share, and like our episodes, which you will be able to find on YouTube and on your favorite podcast platforms. So without further ado, we resume our story with the death of Emperor Dawit I in 1413. Upon the death of Emperor Dawit I in October of that year, his eldest son succeeded to the imperial throne of Ethiopia as Tewodros I. Tewodros, or Theodore, was the son of Dawit I by Empress Tsiyon Mogesa. He was given the additional throne name of Welda Ambassa, or son of the lion. Tewodros I had the misfortune to be overshadowed by a close successor, whom we will discuss shortly, and by a much later emperor of the same name, Tewodros II, who were both considered among the greatest emperors in Ethiopian history. But perhaps this was inevitable, as Tewodros I had a very brief reign. Dr. Getachew Haile, in his work The Different Collections of Nix Hymns in Ethiopic Literature and Contributions, states that Tewodros I only reigned for 9 months, dying on June 23rd of 1414. Both E.A. Wallace Budge and Tekle Mariam, however, state that he reigned for 3 years, but it appears that Tekle Mariam used Budge as his source, and Budge was using later, less accurate sources than Dr. Getachew did. Oddly though, even with this very short reign, Tewodros I was held up for centuries as the ideal emperor, and his reign something of a golden age. Why that is cannot be determined, as the chronicles are silent on the subject, his reign being so brief. The Synaxarium, or Synkasar, of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church commemorates him as a deeply pious man who was devoted to religious literature. E.A. Wallace Budge and Tekle Mariam both write that this was in spite of the fact that Tewodros I rather radically tried to revoke the Ciso Covenant, which granted 1/3 of the land in the empire to the Orthodox Church, an agreement entered into between Emperor Ikonu Amlak and Saint Tekle Haymanot in 1270, nearly 2 centuries earlier. Tewodros had even begun redistributing church lands to tax-paying subjects to benefit both his people and the coffers of the crown. The shortness of his reign ended this effort, however, and Ciso would remain in effect. This act did not earn him lasting animosity from the church, though, as he is praised for limiting himself to one wife in compliance with church dogma, and for his personal piety in the Synkasar. He is praised for giving much from his own property to help the poor. Tewodros I, according to Tekle Mariam, had planned to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to pay homage at the tomb of Christ, but was dissuaded by the Archbishop Abuna Marcos, who warned that his extended absence from the kingdom would invite rebellion, usurpers, and disorder. The death of Tewodros I is rather mysterious, as it is merely stated that he died beyond the Awash River. Professor Tadessa Tamrat, in his book Church and State in Ethiopia, raises the possibility that the chroniclers who had so little to write about Tewodros I may have been trying to cover up a violent death. J.D. Face, in his History of Africa, alleges that Tewodros I died in battle against the Walasmas. No matter the circumstances of his death, he was buried at the church of Tekle Mariam, but was later moved, along with other previous monarchs, to Tekle Mariam by Emperor Mariam I. Tewodros I was succeeded by his younger brother, Yishaq I. Yishaq was given the additional throne name of Gebre Meskel II, which means servant of the cross. He was crowned in June 1414 and would reign for 15 years. Most of the details of his reign are to be found in the work of al-Makrizi, the medieval Arab historian. He is also mentioned in early Amharic poems and several Ge'ez sources. The Ethiopian royal chronicles say of him, Emperor Yishaq I, son of Dawit I, who reigned for 15 years, went down to Wagara and waged war on the Beta Ashur Falasha of Mereba and put in place, or literally seated, 24 judges to rule over all the land and built numerous churches in Dembia and Wagara. He is credited with establishing a monastery church known as Debre Yishaq that was named in his honor. Tekle Mariam notes that the Jews of Simeon and Wagara had long presented a challenge to the Christian monarchs, having raised several large rebellions, particularly during the reign of Dawit I. Indeed, as far back as the reign of Emperor Amde Iyesus I, the Jews of Zegede, Wagara, and Simeon had raised a significant enough rebellion that Amde Iyesus had sent part of his forces under the command of a certain Zegga Christos to put down the rebellion even as he himself was engaged in battle against the Sultan of Yifat. The chronicle specifies that the rebels, in this case, were the Beta Ashur Falasha of Mereba. Tekle theorizes that Beta Ashur were a Falasha clan or an order or sect of the larger Beta Israel or Falasha people, and that they were located in a district called Mereba. James Bruce, in discussing the 24 judges appointed to govern the people, says that they were replacements for 12 judges in Tigray and 12 judges in Shoa, whom the emperor had dismissed because they had opposed his harsh treatment of the Beta Ashur Falashas. Tekle, however, is mystified where Bruce got this information from, as he could not find any source that stated this. It is possible that James Bruce had access to a source that has since been lost, but Tekle also suggests that this is a bit of speculation on Bruce's part. Instead, Tekle believes these 24 judges were put in charge of the Bello people who had periodically rebelled against the crown as well, and who may have joined the Beta Ashur Falashas in this rebellion. Aside from these accounts from Ethiopian sources, there are accounts from Egyptian and Arabian sources of Emperor Yishaq. Al-Makrizi writes that a Mamluk commander named Altambuga al-Tavinga or Altambaga, formerly governor of Said, quarreled with the Sultan of Egypt and fled to Ethiopia, where he pledged loyalty to Emperor Yishaq. This Mamluk commander had knowledge about the production of firearms and shared this knowledge with the Ethiopians. He armed them and organized them in the manner of the Egyptian forces. He had also brought with him 2 subordinates, one of whom helped him in reorganizing the emperor's army, and the other who aggrandized the emperor's court with grand ornamentation, lavish robes, furniture, hangings, and carpets. This unnamed individual persuaded the emperor to dress in the most magnificent robes and to carry a glittering cross-topped staff to ensure that all knew exactly who he was. Makrizi also mentions the presence at the Ethiopian court of a Coptic monk whom he names as Fahir al-Dawla, who gave expert administrative and legal advice to the emperor. Emperor Yishaq I sent a letter to King Alfonso V of Aragon, carried by 2 envoys which reached the king in 1428. Alfonso V was the son of Ferdinand I of Aragon, a member of the Trastamara dynasty that provided monarchs for the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, the crowns of which eventually unite and form the modern Kingdom of Spain. Alfonso succeeded his father as King of Aragon, Valencia, Majorca, and Count of Barcelona in 1416. He claimed the island of Sardinia, though it was then in the possession of Genoa. Alfonso was also in possession of much of Corsica by the 1420s. He became King of Naples as Alfonso I from 1442 to 1458. The Emperor of Ethiopia, in his letter to King Alfonso, proposed an alliance against the Muslims that would be sealed by a royal marriage. The proposed marriage treaty would require Infante Peter of Aragon, Alfonso's illegitimate son, to bring a group of artisans to Ethiopia where he would marry the Emperor Yishaq's daughter. It is not clear how or if King Alfonso responded to the emperor's letter, although in a letter that reached Yishaq's eventual successor, Emperor Zera Yacob in 1450, Alfonso wrote that he would be happy to send artisans to Ethiopia if their safe arrival could be guaranteed, for on a previous occasion, a party of 13 of his subjects traveling to Ethiopia had all died. It is uncertain how or when they met their fate. Travel through the vast Muslim territories between Aragon and Ethiopia was a risky one, politically, never mind the risks from stormy seas, disease, pirates, brigands, and the hazards of crossing parched deserts. Needless to say, Alfonso's son, Infante Peter, did not make it to Ethiopia and never married an Ethiopian princess. It was during the reign of Emperor Yishaq I that the deposed Walasma dynasty of the now defunct Yifat Sultanate would make a comeback. With the death of Sultan Sa'ad ad-Din II at Zela during the reign of Emperor Dawit I, the Walasma princes had fled and taken refuge across the Red Sea in Arabia, particularly at the court of Nasr Ahmed bin Ashraf Ismail, who armed them and sent them back across to the African side of the Red Sea to reclaim their lost sultanate. The Walasmas returned under the command of the eldest of Sa'ad ad-Din II's sons, Sabr ad-Din. Sabr ad-Din, the rest of the Walasma family, and their forces settled at Sayara and declared Sabr ad-Din to be the Walasma Sultan. The loyalists of the Walasma dynasty began to flock to their banner, and thus began the Adal Sultanate of the Walasmas that would be a thorn in the side of Ethiopia's Christian monarchy for the next century. Al-Makrizi states that Sultan Sabr ad-Din defeated the Christian forces at a place called Dakar, and that he torched numerous churches there. However, the Christians returned under the command of a Najat Begal and pushed the Muslim forces back out of that region. They killed Sabr ad-Din's younger brother Muhammad, and another brother of the Sultan, Umar, barely escaped with his life after fighting the Christians in a different location. Things seem to have settled down after this, as Makrizi states that Sabr ad-Din died in the Hijra year 825 and was succeeded by his brother Mansur Sa'ad-Din, who promptly restarted the war against Emperor Yishaq I and the Christians. Al-Makrizi writes that Mansur pushed the emperor's forces all the way to his seat at what he calls Jadaya, and further to Mocha in his initial battles. However, the emperor prevailed in the end and captured both Mansur and his brother Mahamud and kept them imprisoned for the rest of their lives. With Mansur's imprisonment, his brother Jamal ad-Din, sometimes called Gamal-Din, became sultan and swept up territories in Bali, which is modern Bali, Yajza, and Jadaya, killing many Christians and burning countless churches. He thoroughly looted Dawaro and then had the loot sold at cheap rates in markets around the region. Al-Makrizi writes that Jamal ad-Din was able to push Emperor Yishaq I and his forces all the way back to the Blue Nile. René Basset, however, discounts Al-Makrizi's version and states that Yishaq was victorious over the Walasmas at Haraja and that the Walasma Sultan was killed in battle against Yishaq I. E. A. Wallace Budge states that Emperor Yishaq I was assassinated and buried at the Tekle Mariam monastery in Saint in 1430. Taddessa Tamrat, however, believes that the primary sources masked the Emperor Yishaq's death in battle against the Muslims or Adalites. His death is something of a mystery. Nevertheless, Yishaq I has gone down in history as one of Ethiopia's important and effective rulers. He is certainly one of the most prominent between the reigns of Amde Iyesus I and Zera Yacob. It is often repeated that Ethiopian monarchs abandoned the practice of a set capital city and instead began to travel around the empire in a mobile camp, and that this practice began under Emperor Yishaq I. Yishaq I also inspired several works of praise poetry written in a mix of early Amharic and Ge'ez, showing how the Amharic language was emerging from under Ge'ez as the lingua franca of the empire. With the death of Emperor Yishaq I, There followed the very brief reigns of 4 weak monarchs. First came Emperor Endreas, the eldest son of Yishaq I. The chronicle states only that he reigned for 6 months between late 1429 and early 1430. James Bruce wrote only that he was buried next to his father at Tekle Mariam monastery. Endreas was succeeded by Emperor Tekle Mariam, who took the additional throne name of Husbanain. He was the third son of Emperor Dawit I and thus brother to Yishaq I and uncle to Endreas. Emperor Tekle Mariam reigned for 3 years between 1430 and 1433. After his death, he was succeeded by his son, Emperor Sarwe Iyesus, who took the additional throne name of Mihirka-9. Sarwe Iyesus only reigned for 4 months. Budge wrote that Sarwe Iyesus died of the plague. He was succeeded by his brother Amde Iyesus, who took the throne name of Bedel-9 and reigned for 8 months between the end of 1433 and 1434. He is said to have left no children to succeed him. This series of short-reigned emperors raises questions. We have an indication that one may have died of the plague, but there is speculation that these short reigns indicate some instability and that perhaps one or more of these weak emperors were done away with by rivals. The chronicles are remarkably silent on the subject. Tekle Adikmokre remarks that there is an apparent cycle of powerful monarchs such as Amde Iyesus I, Dawit I, and Yishaq I, who were followed by weak successors who had very brief reigns. But he does not pursue further speculation. The death of Emperor Amde Iyesus heralded the enthronement of one of Ethiopia's greatest monarchs, Emperor Zera Yacob. Indeed, Professor Edward Ullendorf would state in his work, The Ethiopians, An Introduction to the Country and People, that Emperor Zera Yacob was unquestionably the greatest ruler Ethiopia had seen since Izana during the heyday of Aksumite power, and none of his successors on the throne, excepted only by Emperors Menelik II and Haile Selassie I, can be compared to him. Likewise, Tekle Adikmokre writes that other than the Aksumite Emperor Abraha or Izana and Caleb, the Zagwe Emperor Lalibela, and Amde Iyesus I, there was no emperor to compare in greatness to Zera Yacob until the 1800s. Count Rossini says much the same. So who was this greatest of Ethiopia's emperors? Zera Yacob was born in 1399 and was the fourth son of Emperor Dawit I and his wife, Empress Igzikibra, a junior wife of Dawit I. He was born in the city of Tilk in Fetagar, where Dawit I had moved his capital in order to be closer to the often rebellious vassal Yifat Sultanate. The kingdom of Fetagar had been a vassal kingdom that extended south from Tegulet and included those areas of Shawa known today as Bulga, Shankora, Minjar, Adama or Nazrit, and extended as far as Arsi and Bali or Bali. It bordered Yifat, Dawaro, Damot, and Gojam as well as Adal. Tekle Adikmokre writes that while Zera Yacob was just a child, hermit monks had prophesied that he would succeed to the throne and become a great emperor. This prophecy earned him the deep resentment and suspicion of his elder brothers, especially Tewodros I, who bore him particular ill will. Fearful for her son, Empress Igzikibra had her son sent into hiding in the north in Tigray. He first hid in the monastery of St. Mary of Zion at Aksum, and later at the Abba Samuel monastery at Debra Abbay. In these monasteries, the young prince served the community as any other young novice would by chopping wood, cooking, cleaning, serving elder monks, and studying about monastic life and theological topics from them. He became very theologically and doctrinally learned. Only a select few of the monks in the monastery knew that he was a prince and the son of Dawit I. However, eventually he was found by the authorities. While Tekle's Adik Mokria quotes the chronicles as saying that he was found by soldiers upon the death of his nephew Amde Iyesus, this contradicts Zera Yacob's own writings in his Maz'af Habrahan, or Book of Light, that he was brought down from the royal prison on Amba Gishan when Amde Iyesus died in 1434. Taddesa Tamrat also questions the chronicler's version for the same reason. It would appear that he was found out at Debre Abbay during the reign of Tewodros I around 1414 and brought back and imprisoned on Amba Gishan with other members of the imperial dynasty. Amba Gishan, also being a monastery, however, allowed him to continue in his studies of doctrine, dogma, theology, and church musicology as well. Now, in the Ethiopian monarchy, the system had developed that while the wishes of an emperor as to who should succeed him were generally respected, it was the council of nobles who advised the emperor who would ultimately decide whether to follow his wishes or to bring down another prince of imperial blood from Tekle Mariam that they believed to be a more appropriate choice as emperor and crown him. When Zera Yacob's brother Yishaq I died, his name was raised as a possible successor to the throne, but the nobles decided to follow Yishaq I's wishes, and so it was Zera Yacob's nephew Endreas who succeeded to the throne of his father Yishaq I. Endreas's reign, as we've already noted, was to be very brief, and Zera Yacob's name was raised again as a potential successor, but was his elder brother Tekle Mariam who was chosen and brought down from Gishan to be crowned. Tekle Mariam was succeeded in turn by two of his sons, Sarwe Iyesus and Amde Iyesus, but at each of these successions, Zera Yacob's name had come up as an alternative candidate for the throne. With the deaths of his three elder brothers, he was now the senior member of the dynasty and was perhaps seen as the more mature alternative to his younger nephews. When Amde Iyesus died in 1434, there were several more of his brothers, sons of Emperor Tekle Mariam, still imprisoned on Gishan along with their uncle Zera Yacob. Now it seems that with the succession of brief and weak monarchs, the council decided to go with the mature choice, and it was Zera Yacob, son of Dawit I, who was brought down from Gishan to succeed his dead nephew. Interestingly, once enthroned, Zera Yacob carried out a somewhat ruthless but perhaps dynastically essential act. According to Manuel de Almeida, a Jesuit priest who wrote his Historia de Ethiopia a Alta u Abbasia 2 centuries later, Zera Yacob ordered the surviving descendants of his brother Emperor Tekle Mariam to be taken from the royal prison on Amba Gishan and exiled to a hot, fetid land which was rife with diseases. The location of this land is not specified, but apparently these sons and grandsons of Emperor Tekle Mariam survived and even thrived there. Apparently, Emperor Amde Mariam I, early in his reign, tried to redress this exile and recalled his cousins from exile, but they murdered his messengers, and Amde Mariam sent a punitive mission and had 80 of them beheaded. De Almeida recorded that these royal descendants were still rigorously watched 200 years later. There is, of course, a long tradition of monarchs around the world trying to push out or eliminate rival branches of their royal dynasties. The English War of the Roses between the Lancastrian and Yorkist branches of the House of Plantagenet, including the mysterious disappearance of the Yorkist princes in the Tower, perhaps murdered by their uncle Richard III, is a well-known example. Much later, there is the overthrow of the child emperor of the Russias, Ivan VI, by Empress Elizabeth Petrovna of Russia, solidifying the line of Peter the Great on the throne and eliminating that of his elder brother, Ivan V. Even more recently, there are the wars between the Carlist and Isabelline lines of the Bourbon dynasty in Spain, which are a much more recent Western instance of dynastic rivalry. There would be other instances in Ethiopia of one line of the dynasty forcibly pushing out and eliminating another line, but we will discuss those as we come to them. So in 1434, Emperor Zera Yacob assumed the throne as King of Kings of Ethiopia, taking the additional throne name of Constantinos. He delayed his coronation for 2 years and was crowned in Aksum in 1436 and remained there for 3 years. Zera Yacob's mother, the Dowager Empress Igzi was still alive at the beginning of his reign and presided over his court at his side. In his youth, the emperor had married Empress Tekle Mariam, who was also known by her additional reign name of Jan Haila. She was his Gra Baaltihat, or Queen of the Left, and thus his senior wife. By her, the emperor had 4 much-loved daughters, Birhan Zameda, Medhin Zameda, Tekle Mariam, and Dil Dibaba. He would later marry 2 other wives. His second wife was Empress Eleni, who had the additional reign name of Jan Zala. She held the position of Qeng Baaltihat, or Queen of the Right, and junior wife. Empress Eleni would not bear any children, yet she is perhaps the most famous of any of the queens of that era and a woman whose influence would extend through the reigns of 4 further emperors. More about Empress Eleni later. Emperor Zera Yacob had a third wife, Empress Tsiyon Mogasa. She held the position of Baalta Shehona, or Queen of the Thigh, and was his most junior consort. Empress Tsiyon Mogasa was the mother of Zera Yacob's heir, the future Emperor Amde Mariam I. Zera Yacob had numerous other children, although it is not clear which ones were the children of Empress Tsiyon Mogasa and which were born to various concubines. His sons, beside Amde Mariam, included Abeto Tewodros, who bore the title Jan Sabberras, Abeto Galaudius, Abeto Amde Mariam, Abeto Amde Tsiyon, Abeto Zera Abraham, Abeto Batra Tsiyon, and daughters Rom Ganaela, Adel Mengsa, Atnaf Samra, Ameta Gyurgis, Sophia, Ameta Mesih, and his niece Atnaf Sagadu. His family was very large, and they would play a prominent role in his reign. He was 35 years old when he ascended to the throne of his fathers. Tekle's Adikmokrias stresses the great historical value of Zera Yacob's imperial chronicles. While the chronicles of many emperors are very sparse with details, and those that are not sparse, like Amde Iyesus I, were almost purely focused on the emperor's military exploits. Zera Yacob's Ge'ez chronicles, however, are an excellent record of non-military matters such as administrative and religious affairs as well. Centuries later, De Almeida and Bruce both used Zera Yacob's chronicles as a source for their writings in Portuguese and English respectively. The chronicles of Emperor Zera Yacob and Emperor Amde Mariam I were both looted from Magdala by British forces in 1868 and can now be found and studied in the collection of the British Museum. Thus, they have been available as valuable sources to many European scholars studying Ethiopian history, such as August Dillman, William Wright, and Jules Perchot, who have translated them and published them. Emperor Zera Yacob set out early in his reign to stamp out what he termed as idol worship. He was determined to eliminate all forms of animist and pagan ritual and worship by means of proclamation and harsh punishments when necessary. It is possible that these efforts against idolatry may have been what delayed his traveling to Aksum to be crowned for 3 years, as his chronicler mentions his anti-idolatry campaign before mentioning his coronation at Aksum. Tekle's Adikmokria theorizes that it is not just his personal piety and devotion to Christianity that motivated Emperor Zera Yacob to stamp out these pagan or animist sects. He allows that perhaps the emperor believed that converting non-Christians to the faith would reduce division and promote harmony in the realm, making it more easily governable. The chronicle speaks about the worshippers of a spirit or idol named Desk, and another named Dino. E. A. Wallace Budge also mentions other cults for lesser deities named Dail, Guidale, Tafanat, and Makawaze. Less is known about these cults, but the major cults that were known were those of Desk and Dino, and the suppression of those are better documented than the suppression of these lesser cults. Certain personages acknowledged that they worshipped these deities and falsely accused many others of having joined them in their worship in order to either divert punishment or dilute it somehow. Among these people was a man named Zera Yacob, which means seed of Zion. The Chronicle says that he falsely accused so many people of idolatry while secretly worshipping Desk himself that he earned the nickname Zera Satan, or seed of Satan. The Chronicle relates that when he was found out, he was exiled to Haik, but does not further elaborate how he was punished or what his ultimate fate was. Declared devil worshippers, others like this man, were dealt with harshly and many were killed. The emperor cursed these worshippers, saying that they had falsely accused others of having worshipped with them, and saying, "May the blood of the innocent be upon them." Many were killed, but how, where, and how many has not been related by the Chronicle. This brutality is not much different from the religious persecutions of those who did not conform to the religions of state in other parts of the world. This is especially true of the rulers in Europe, who empowered their churches to stamp out dissenters. The Spanish Inquisition, acting against non-Catholic Christianity, the Northern European Protestants' campaign against Catholics, and the general suppression of Judaism, Islam, and pagan faiths was common in Europe, and Islamic persecution of other faiths across the Middle East and North Africa are all good examples. This type of religious intolerance would continue to exist well into what we considered the modern age. The Chronicle states that the emperor proved to be merciless in this regard, even against his own children who were implicated. The Chronicle mentions his son Abito Galaudius, Abito Amde Mariam, Abito Zera Abraham, Abito Batratzion, and his daughters Dil Samra, Rom Ganayala, and Adal Mangasa as apparent Desk worshippers. The punishment for idolatry was death, and the emperor's family were not accepted from this punishment. Besides those who stubbornly adhered to their faith that were put to death, there were many more who repented after being publicly flogged. The emperor ordered a public proclamation to be issued ordering that those who had renounced the worship of Satan and his demons were to have the mark of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit tattooed on their forehead, and a praise denouncing Satan in the name of Jesus Christ on their left arm, and renouncing Desk the cursed and pledging loyalty to Mary the Mother of God on their right arm. It is often said that this began the long-time Ethiopian tradition of tattooing crosses and religious figures on foreheads, necks, hands, and arms, as well as embroidering crosses on clothing. The emperor ordered that those who refused to do so were to have their homes searched and to be flogged in public. Yet even with these measures being taken, the worship of Desk and Dino seems to have persisted at least at some level for a while, particularly worship of Desk. Indeed, Zera Yacob's successor, Emperor Amde Mariam I, is also reported to have made efforts to suppress the worship of this deity. Ultimately, the suppression of the cult of Desk was so successful that little is known of this religion and its customs. Alec Ataye, in his handwritten history, states that in Shawa near Babit, above Sengaboka, was a small hill named Bilet. Alec Ataye wrote that this was now the site of a church dedicated to Saint Tekle, but that this once was the location of a great temple known as Beta Desk, or House of Desk. This pagan shrine was venerated by the local Gafat people, and that even old Christian monarchs and many great nobles would stop at the shrine before marching to war to ask of the servants of this idol about their fortune. He writes that Saint Tekle himself was responsible for the destruction of this temple. However, it would seem that the worship of Desk had continued for a further 2 centuries if it was still being suppressed by Zera Yacob and his son Amde Mariam. Zera Yacob in particular was determined that this worship of Desk was to be stamped out. He was so determined to stamp it out that he did not spare members of his own family. In his proclamation in regard to the matter, he states, "O Christian people, when we forbade the works of Satan and the worship of Desk and Dino, we found that it had entered our own house and had led our own children to error. After Zera Yacob became emperor, the ruler of Hadiyya, Garad Mahiko, had refused to submit to the crown and pay his tribute. Hadiyya was a Muslim kingdom of the ethnic Sidama people located south of the Blue Nile and west of the Awash. The kingdom, ruled over by a monarch titled as Garad, was a vassal state of the emperors of Ethiopia and fell under the overlordship of the Walasma sultans of Yifat as the senior Muslim vassals of the empire. However, Hadiyya had tended to side with the emperors against Yifat whenever the Walasmas rebelled. When the Walasmas lost Yifat and eventually moved their seat to the Adal Sultanate, Hadiyya had become a direct vassal of the crown, and the Walasmas no longer were their overlords. Garad Mahiko was the son of Garad Mahomet, who had been an ally to previous Ethiopian monarchs and a compliant vassal. Mahiko's refusal to pay his tribute to the crown and pay homage to Zera Yacob as his father had done with previous emperors was a blatant act of rebellion. One of Garad Mahiko's officers, Ganyicho Garad, defected from his side and came to the emperor in Shoa and told him details of Mahiko's rebellion, which local lords were adhering to the rebellion, and how the Sultan of Adal was abetting the rebellion. The emperor could not let such an act of rebellion go unanswered. At the advice of Ganyicho Garad, Zera Yacob summoned Garad Bamu, an uncle of Garad Mahiko and the lord of the district of Dagan. With great pomp and ceremony, Zera Yacob proclaimed Bamu as the new Garad of Hadiyya. He lavished great gifts on him, armed him, directed the army of Damut to join him, and march on Hadiyya to claim the throne of his vassal kingdom. Garad Bamu kissed the emperor's feet before marching off to claim the kingdom he had granted him. When news that Bamu, a senior and respected member of their royal family, had been appointed as their new Garad reached the nobles of Hadiyya, one by one they abandoned Mahiko and came to pay homage to Bamu and pledge allegiance to Emperor Zera Yacob. With the help of these nobles, Garad Mahiko was deposed by Zera Yacob in favor of his uncle Garad Bamu. Garad Mahiko then fled and sought sanctuary at the court of the Walasma Sultan of Adal. He would be slain by the Ethiopian regiment known as Adal Mabrak, or Lightning of Adal, and Damot forces known as Damot Dahari, who pursued him into Adal territory and killed him at an amba called Sagamadal, which means land of meat. The chronicles record that the Adal Mabrak sent Mahiko's head and limbs to Zera Yacob as proof of his death. Emperor Zera Yacob was jubilant and ordered a great celebration to mark the victory. Gayincho Garad was rewarded with a proclamation that he was to have hereditary rule over his districts and that he would no longer be a mere vassal to the Garad of Hadiyya, but a Garad in his own right and a direct vassal of the Emperor of Ethiopia. He was basically now a ruler of his own kingdom within the Ethiopian Empire. Emperor Zera Yacob wanted to bind Hadiyya more firmly to his throne, and so he married Hadiyya's princess, daughter of the late Garad Mahomet, sister of the late Garad Mahiko, and niece of the new Garad Bamu. This marriage, perhaps considered a small detail of the settlement, was probably the most consequential event of the entire episode. The bride was renamed Eleni upon her baptism before their marriage and would become one of the greatest dowager empresses in the history of Ethiopia. She was named for the Empress Helena, or Eleni, mother of the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, who happened to be the namesake of her new husband, as Zera Yacob's reign name was Constantinos. Eleni would go on to serve as senior advisor and regent across the reigns of 4 subsequent emperors. As his Queen Baaltihat, or Queen of the Right, Empress Eleni would be exposed to the workings of the Ethiopian imperial court. She is perhaps second to none among the empress consorts and dowager of the era as far as her importance. It is during the reign of Emperor Zera Yacob that we see the first use of the title of Etegi, used as the title of the empress consort. In the chronicle, it refers to Ite Zala, which was the reign name of Empress Eleni. Tekle's Adikmokre explains that the title of Eteke is derived from the phrase Igzit, a Giz word meaning Our Lady, while the sound Ge is an appendage meaning land. The Virgin Mary is referred to in Giz as Tekle Mariam, or Our Lady Mary. In regard to the sound Ge, Gura Ge means land of Gura, Harar Ge means land of Harar, so Eteke means lady or mistress of the land. As we have seen, Zera Yacob had 3 known consorts. Each would have been revered and respected and had an exalted role in his household. More about them later. After his victory over Hadiyah, Zera Yacob turned to embellishing his court by building his magnificent palace at Debre Birhan. According to Richard Pankhurst, the city of Debre Birhan was established by Emperor Zera Yacob in the year 1456. It is said that Zera Yacob witnessed a great heavenly light on the 6th or 7th of March of that year. He was so profoundly affected that he ordered the building of a church dedicated to the Holy Trinity on the spot and gave the church the title of Debre Birhan, or Mount of Light. This became the name of the locality, and the emperor made it his seat. The church he built there and the town he established around it attracted more and more people, and a new capital was born. Some have tried to explain away the miraculous light seen by Emperor Zera Yacob as being Halley's Comet, which did indeed make an appearance that year, but the dates do not correspond because the comet would have been most visible in mid-June and not early March. With the Hadiyah campaign successfully ended, Zera Yacob turned to embellishing his capital by building a palace which would long be described by his countrymen as a wonder. The walls surrounding the enclosure were said to be toweringly tall and to have been blindingly white. There was a lion house built to house the emperor's pet lions, and next to it was a huge hall so grand in its proportions that the emperor could enter it comfortably seated on horseback. The various gates were surmounted by towers, except for one reserved for the Agabi Sa'ad and servants of the emperor's household and of his kitchens, which had no tower, and which was closed to all other people on pain of death. The interior of the emperor's home was built with massive wood beams which were so large and heavy they each had to be carried by 2 very strong men. These beams were joined together to form the palace walls in a way that it was not apparent how they were joined together. They had been peeled of bark and were said to be shining white in appearance. These walls of the emperor's house were described as being either 20 or 15 yards high by different sources. The palace was surmounted by a great cross made of gold. From the palace to the Church of the Trinity was an enclosed passage which the emperor could use to go back and forth with his close household without being seen by the public. This was done to conceal his piety from all but God himself. Tekle's Adikmokre writes that when the emperor took communion, the liturgy would be attended only by monks who consumed no meat and drank no form of wine. They would be brought from the great monasteries around his empire to witness him taking Holy Communion and to pray for him. On great feast days, the emperor would allow for the deptaras, or learned church scholar clergy, to be present to sing traditional hymns and compose Kene poetry in honor of the occasion, but they were not allowed to witness him taking Holy Communion. Zera Yacob's court was one of magnificence and was one of many rituals and ceremonies. The system of court roles and titles became even more highly developed during Zera Yacob's reign than it had been previously. With his queens, his extensive family, his high court nobles and clergy, and the vassal kings and sultans that owed him fealty, Zera Yacob was indeed a king of kings, an imperial ruler who was as magnificent and powerful as any of his age. As part of the system of his court was the presence of a large group of young men known as Chewa. The term refers to someone who has been well brought up, is refined, and is the opposite of vulgar. This group of young men were members of the families of the vassal kings and sultans, regional nobles and chiefs. They were brought or sent to the emperor's court as a pledge of loyalty and trust to the then monarch, but were also a measure of ensuring that these regional rulers stayed in step and did not rebel against the emperor while their sons were in his custody. It also secured them against these sons rebelling against their fathers as well. These boys and young men were raised in the emperor's court, trained as pages, and served his household. These young men were organized in different teams or houses bearing special names. These members of the Chowa houses or teams would later provide the pool of talent from which the emperors would choose their court officials, regional governors, and military officers based on their merits and talents observed from their boyhood training and service. The organization of these Chowa into houses or teams seems, however, to have caused problems with them organizing small-scale revolts, particularly against those authorized to discipline them by the emperor. The chronicle relates that a Chowa house known as the Jans Agana had rebelled due to being disciplined, and so the emperor wrote to them, saying, "You have been angered that the Asmach I appointed over you flogged you in order to civilize you, and so you have chosen to go to the Islamic lands, although you once depended on me and on the Asmach. But now I have set a new group of Chowa over you, according to the command of God. Now stop your previous evil and live according to custom and the law. If you refuse to do so, we will decide punishment over you." He then placed other Chowa teams to authority in various districts. Of the Chowa appointees, the greatest individual title he appointed was the Bahar Nagash. The title Bahar Nagash means king or ruler of the sea, and his territories encompassed those northern regions that were adjacent to the Red Sea coast. Zera Yacob set the Bahar Nagash as a vassal ruler with authority over district governors such as the Shire Shum, or governor of Shire, the Siyuma Sarai, or Sarai Shum, the two Kantibas of Hamasein, and the Siyuma Bur, or Burshum, governor of Bur. The territories presided over by this vassal king are today parts of the modern state of Eritrea and the northern parts of what is now the Ethiopian regional state of Tigray. The chronicle states that thus Zera Yacob spread, beautified, and restored the old system and introduced a new system and illuminated that which had been dark. One of the traits that makes Emperor Zera Yacob unique for his time, not only for Ethiopia, but across the region and indeed the world, was the level of authority he entrusted to women. Tekle Mariam notes that while Emperor Amde Iyesus I had named his wife Blaine Saba as Tiyimta Enderta, making her the ruler of the district of Enderta, Zera Yacob went further. He granted two of his daughters the title of K'ain Behitwadded and Gra Behitwadded. The title of Behitwadded eventually developed into the title of Bitwadded. The meaning of the words Behitwadded mean one that is singularly loved or uniquely loved. The K'ain and Gra designations indicated that one was beloved of the right and the other of the left, and so these designations indicate that there were traditionally always two holders of the Behitwadded title. The function of the two Behitwaddeds were separate and different, however. One Behitwadded was outward-facing, acting as second-in-command in military affairs, while the other was inward-facing, being second-in-command in the emperor's court, overseeing administration, palace functions, and governing. In matters of protocol, the Behitwaddeds followed the bishop, the Echege, and the Akabi Sa'at in precedence in the imperial court. The bearers of this title would enjoy the rank and position of regents and prime ministers in future reigns right into the modern era, as we will see in future episodes. Tekle Mariam relates that Zera Yacob was unprecedented in removing male Behitwaddeds like the powerful Behitwadded Amde, who happened to be his son-in-law, and replacing them with his own daughters. Tekle Mariam believed that this was to remove these powerful figures from the scene and consolidate power in his own hands via his daughters, who were more directly connected to him and firmly loyal to him. According to the chronicle, Behitwadded Amde was charged with adultery, but implied there were other more political reasons by stating and other numerous undisclosed crimes and sins as being the cause of his removal. Indeed, it would seem strange for an emperor with 3 wives and numerous concubines to remove an official for adultery, even if it was committed by the husband of one of his own daughters. It appears that the emperor concluded that he could perhaps rely more on the loyalty of his daughters and nieces than on that of his male officials and relations who were potential rivals. So Zera Yacob appointed a slew of his female relatives to powerful posts. His daughter Medhin Zemeda was made Qein Behitweded. He also made her governor of Damut. His daughter Birhan Zemeda became his Grabi Hitweded, replacing her exiled husband Amde Iyesus. He appointed his daughter Dil Samra as governor of Tigray, his daughter Adel Mogasa or Bahar Megasa as governor of Angut, his daughter Ametamesi as governor of Amhara, his daughter Sophia was made governor of Gudim, his daughter Amete Georgis was made governor of Ifat, and his daughter Rom Ganaela was made governor of Shawa. His daughter Tekle Mariam was made governor of Begemter, and his niece Asnaf Segadu, the daughter of a sister of the emperor, was made governor of Bagay. Unfortunately, these daughters and niece proved not to be any more loyal than his male appointees, as all of them would eventually rebel against him, and he would remove them at various times and replace them with male officials. It appears that Emperor Zera Yacob had generally difficult relations with his family, as we will see later. According to Tekle Mariam, the emperor removed these princesses from their governorships and replaced them with men bearing the titles of Iraq Masari and Sahif Lahim. Zera Yacob valued discretion among his officials, and so he ordered that members of his inner circle restrain themselves from taking meals as guests in other people's homes or engaging in close relationships with outside women for fear that they would discuss the happenings of his court and his own utterances. In the third year of his reign, Emperor Zera Yacob decided to go north to Aksum in order to be crowned at the Cathedral of St. Mary of Zion in the tradition of his Solomonic ancestors, stretching back to the age of the Aksumite Empire. It appears from the chronicles that Zera Yacob had been crowned early in his reign at a place called Midredego, but that a more formal ceremony at Aksum was needed to underline his legitimate succession to the Solomonic throne, and so, like several other emperors before him, he repeated his coronation at St. Mary of Zion. According to Tekle Mariam, quoting the chronicles, this coronation was a lavish event. When the emperor arrived at Aksum with his huge entourage, the clergy and the people of the area poured out to receive him joyfully. The nobility of Tigray received him mounted on their horses, carrying their shields and spears, and the women of the province welcomed him with songs and exultations. As the emperor approached the gates of Aksum, the Tigray Makonnen, or the Lord of Tigray, and the Nebre Ed of Aksum stood on either side of the gate, holding out olive branches for the emperor to pass under as he entered the ancient and holy former capital of the empire. A long carpet had been laid from the gates of Aksum up to the cathedral for the emperor, and as he passed over it, he had 100 wagats of gold tossed onto it as a gift to Aksum for the honor done to him, and to render homage to the Virgin Mary in Zion. A wagat is an Ethiopian measure that is roughly 28 grams. On Thursday, January 28, 1436, or Tr 21, 1428 on the Ethiopian calendar, Emperor Zera Yacob sat on the ancient stone throne outside the Cathedral of St. Mary of Zion and was crowned King of Kings of Ethiopia. Tekle Mariam states that this ancient throne, often referred to as the Throne of Izana, had its own enclosure. The emperor was then taken to a separate stone seat where he received blessings. Here, there were 12 stone seats on either side of the emperor for the 12 judges, and a seat for the bishop. They sat here, resplendent in their glittering robes, around the majestic emperor in his crown enthroned in glory. Taddisa Tamrat writes that Zera Yacob would remain in Aksum for 3 years. During his residence in the ancient capital, where he had once hidden as a fugitive prince hiding from his brother Tewodros I, Zera Yacob tried to pay his personal debt that he felt he owed. He reorganized the monastic community, appointing a monk titled Lika Aksum to serve under the Nebre Ed and who would be in charge of the monastic affairs there. The emperor also ordered the perpetual celebration of the Sa'atat, or the ceremony of the hours, as well as the Agwagwam, as a permanent and daily ritual at this monastery. He granted the monastery all the income of lands in the district called Noadare, and he summoned the greatest liturgical and doctrinal experts from around his realm to come and serve at St. Mary of Zion at Aksum. He also gave the cathedral rich vestments and gold vessels for use during Holy Liturgy. After his extended stay at Aksum, Emperor Zera Yacob returned to Shoa via the province of Amhara. The then province of Amhara is what would later be called Wallo and was located between the provinces of Begemder to the west, Tigray to the north, Angut to the north and east, and Shoa to the south. As he moved through Amhara, he came upon a locality known as Zahaya, where he saw a peak which he thought would be ideal to build a church. Further investigation of this tableland found the incomplete construction of a church on its eastern end, which had been begun by his father Dawit I years earlier but never finished. The chronicle eloquently ties the biblical story of King David of Israel not being able to build the Temple of Jerusalem, which was eventually built by his son Solomon, to this instance, where a church that could not be completed by the Ethiopian Emperor David would now be finished by his son Zera Yacob. Zera Yacob not only completed his father's church on the eastern end of the tableland, but also constructed a separate church on the western end of the tableland. Everyone, young and old, rich and poor, noble and commoner, were asked to carry stones and wood to the construction site in order to help speed the building of these two churches. One church was named Mekanagol, and the other was named Debre Negodquad. Mekanagol means house of the manger, and was likely a church of Jesus, Emmanuel, or the Nativity of Christ, Ba'alawald. And Debre Negodquad means Mount of Thunder, and was likely a church of St. John the Apostle and Evangelist, who is referred to in the Ethiopian church as Johannes Walde Negodquad, or John son of Thunder. He placed numerous clergy and deptaras, or liturgical scholars, at these churches, and granted these churches large land estates to support them. Emperor Zera Yacob had his father Dawit I's remains brought from its initial burial place and buried at Debre Negodquad. Emperor Zera Yacob moved on to Debre Libanos, where he also gave large land grants to the monastery and reorganized the monastic community. He gave large gifts of vestments to Debre Libanos as well, and instituted the celebration of the Dormition of the Virgin Mary at Debre Libanos at this time as well. From there he moved on to Midredego, where he had his first coronation 6 years earlier. At Midredego he built a new church dedicated to the Holy Virgin Mary, which he named Tekle Mariam, or House of Mary. Like the other churches he had built previously, he granted this church numerous landholdings and appointed senior clergy to serve there. He gave this church to the patronage of his senior wife, Ngra Baltihat, Empress Mariam, also known as Jan Haila, to serve as her memorial and to be her eventual burial place. The empress would indeed eventually be buried here. In the 7th year of his reign, Emperor Zera Yacob returned to Tuglet district of Shoa and settled for a time at a place called Uguba, where he celebrated Timgat, or the baptism of Christ, and decided to remain for a while. While he was staying at this place, news arrived from Egypt that the Mameluke regime in Cairo had ordered the destruction of the Coptic Orthodox Church of the Virgin Mary at Mitmak. This church was the reputed site of regular apparitions of the Holy Virgin and had become a major site of pilgrimage that included not just Christians but many Muslims who came to see these appearances and receive miraculous cures. Zera Yacob, who revered the Virgin Mary very deeply and who was a particularly devout man, was shocked. He had the Coptic bishop of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church sit and receive condolences as chief mourner, and ordered full court mourning as if a queen mother had died. For 40 days, dirges were sung as the emperor and his entire court wept for the destruction of this great Egyptian church. The emperor then ordered the building of a new church of the Holy Virgin Mary at the location of Uguba to replace the church that the Egyptians had destroyed. He named the new church of the Virgin Mary Debre Mitmak and invested it with large amounts of land, rich vessels, and vestments, and appointed senior clergy to serve there. In our next episode, we will cover part 2 of the reign of Emperor Zera Yacob the Great. Until then, please check out our website for additional information at www.ethiopiahistory.org. www.tarikamba.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Look for audio versions of us on Spotify, Anchor, and other podcast channels, and on social media. Send us your questions and comments via solomon@tarikamba.com or our social media account.